Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated at 4 p.m., and then at 4:30 you get to see last week's episode again. Also at my site, that's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org, you'll find this episode of Wichita Liberty TV, all the old episodes, show notes about each episode, and then all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So today we're continuing to look at the candidates for upcoming election, and this week it's the 4th Congressional District of Kansas, the seat currently held by Representative Ron Estes. The 4th District covers the Wichita metropolitan area and then counties to the west all the way out to Greensburg and to the east, all the way to Chautauqua County, which is, I think, what's in Chautauqua County, Carl? I can't remember.
A lot of windmills and cattle.
Something like that. Anyway, so that's the 4th District of Kansas. Our guest today is Ron Estes, United States Representative Ron Estes, who is the incumbent. He is also the nominee of the Republican Party, having won a primary election in August. His opponent is Democrat James Thompson, who also won the primary in August, and they'll meet up on November 6th in the general election. I've been telling you for a long time when the deadline to vote was, but by the time this episode's available, that deadline has passed. So Representative Ron Estes, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. Carl Peterjohn, thanks there. And what is in Chautauqua County? Is that Independence?
No, Independence is in Montgomery County,
okay,
just to the east of there. So Sedan and Howard.
Okay, yeah, quite some metropolises there. Anyway, so Representative Estes, you've been our representative in Congress for about a year and a half or so, now up for re-election. Why should we continue to trust you to represent us in Congress?
Well, it's been an honor to represent the 4th District. You know, I was elected in a special election last April after Mike Pompeo was nominated to be CIA director. Mm-hmm. And you know, when I look back over the last year and a half, actually 2 years really, all of the things that have been accomplished. I mean, we focused on how do we get the economy growing. You know, the second quarter of this year, it's up at 4.2%, mm-hmm, which is a whole lot better than during the Obama administration that it was stuck at 1.9%. What we're seeing with that faster growing economy, more jobs, people getting pay raises, bonuses. Some of that's tied to regulatory reform. Some of it's tied to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we were able to pass. And you look at how much that's benefited folks, as I said, with bonuses, pay raises. We're seeing companies starting to bring money back that was trapped overseas because of our tax code was a double taxation on that profits that they'd made and paid taxes on, mm-hmm, overseas. So it's just growing our economy. Right now, just even today, I guess the Labor Department announced that there's 7.1 million job openings and just under 6 million people that are unemployed. Mm-hmm. So actually now we're in a situation where we're trying to get more workers to fill those jobs. And so we've put a focus on how do we help that. I'm on the Education and Workforce Committee, and we put effort into how do we get people more technical training, more focus on helping to be welders and auto mechanics and airplane power plant mechanics, just because that's where we have a big need right now.
Because it's not just that there's a shortage of workers, there's always a mismatch sometimes between what employers need and what people can actually do. So
That's right. You want to make sure you have the right education so the folks can get those well-paying jobs that enable them. You know, and you know, I talked a lot about the economy, which obviously that's one thing I keep an eye on, but there's been so many things that we've accomplished. We've had some additional funding for opioid addiction, some additional funding for mental health. We've passed bills like the Right to Try, which basically allows our individuals who have cancer or other terminal diseases the ability to go try medication that hasn't been completely approved by the FDA, because that's really their last chance. And we want them to have the choice of being able to do that.
Let me ask you, is that available in the veterans hospitals? Because the veterans issue and veterans hospitals had been a huge problem during the end of the Obama administration.
It really has. There's been a lot of problems at the VA hospitals, and that's actually one of the things that we've promoted as well, is doing two things. One, the VA Mission Act, which was to improve choice, which we're just rolling out the rules and regulations for that, and that won't be fully in effect until March of 2019, people being able to do that. But one of the other bills we passed was the VA Accountability Act, and one of the things that the VA secretary has struggled with is that they didn't have the authority through the Obama administration as well as in the Trump administration, but they didn't have the authority to fire employees who weren't doing their jobs.
There were some pretty notable examples where high-level people, executives making a lot of money, were fired, and then they appealed and wormed their way back in.
That's right. So we wanted to make sure that they had the tools and resources so that we could get good people hired as well as terminate people that aren't doing their job, weren't capable of doing their job, because, after all, our veterans have given so much and support the freedoms that we enjoy, and we need to make sure we provide them the medical coverage.
Let's take our first commercial break for today on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm your host, Bob Weeks. We've got co-host Carl Peterjohn and our guest today, United States Representative Ron Estes, who's also a candidate for re-election to that position. So, Representative Estes, a couple weeks ago, you had an opinion piece in the Wichita Eagle talking about Medicare. About a week later, the opponent, James Thompson, wrote back again. He's in favor of, and he defended when he was on the show last week, the idea of Medicare for all. And I think your title was, or your op-ed said, if we have Medicare for everybody, it's going to really threaten the program for the people who really need it. I guess it's just the guys like me and Carl, the older people.
Yeah, they're really being misleading and deceptive at the least, and in terms of what they call Medicare for all. And the Democrats are rallied around this, including my opponent, this Bernie Sanders type plan to do the so-called Medicare for all, but it's really government takeover and running of healthcare. And what that program does, what they're promoting is, we take a step back and look at how Medicare was originally structured. It was set up as a pay-as-you-go process. People contribute into it while they're working and then draw out of it when they're retiring from somebody else's contributions while they're working. Well, you can't do that if you're drawing out at the same time you're working. So they're really being disingenuous and deceitful in terms of that process.
And a lot of money was transferred from Medicare's trust fund to help pay for Obamacare, and that put a big hit on Medicare that's in the worst shape of any of the entitlement programs, as I understand. So what do we need to do to strengthen Medicare? And it's got to keep that separate from Medicaid. It often gets confused. But Medicare for seniors and protect our most vulnerable seniors.
That's right. It really was. In order to fund Obamacare, partially fund Obamacare, because they didn't completely fund it, they did steal from Medicare to do that. As you said, Medicare is still not paying its own way. So when we look at a worker, a typical 65-year-old retiree, when they have looked through their career, they've paid in about $175,000. When they retire and pull out their medical care, they pull out the equivalent of roughly $440,000 in health care expenses. So already it's underwater every year today with the typical retirees. So we can't just turn that around and start throwing additional people into that during their working careers, because it'll make it even worse underwater. One of the estimates from one of the institutes, which wasn't really a conservative, it was more of a liberal institute, but they said it'd cost over $32 trillion over the next 10 years to do this so-called Medicare for all, which more than doubles everybody's taxes and still won't be enough to pay for it. And so when some of the other provisions that don't get talked about in that is that, and this is where my opponent is really misleading on, is he says it'll create more competition, is that the bill that Bernie Sanders has proposed actually outlaws the ability for you or I to buy health insurance outside of this government-run program.
And seniors, once you're 65, you have to be in Medicare, don't you? I mean, there's really, unless you're hugely wealthy like Charles Koch or somebody, you've got to be in the Medicare system.
The only exception, and I can speak a little bit from experience, is if you're currently employed and covered under, still working and covered under a plan. But you do have to file for Medicare, but you kind of put a suspension on it until you say, yes, please turn it on.
You do have to file. your Medicare actually becomes secondary to your employer's insurance that's provided. And that way people don't game the system, or companies don't game the system in terms of putting all their over 65 or over 67 aged employees onto Medicare instead of continuing to provide them services. So, but you do have to file, otherwise it costs you more as a recipient of Medicare. But that is a program it was intentionally designed to be, it's kind of, you call it a pyramid scheme, really, as a pay-as-you-go process, because people pay in while they're working and then draw out what other people pay in while they're working. And so...
Are you saying the trust fund really wasn't a trust fund in a sense?
The trust fund really wasn't a trust fund of your and my contributions that were being dedicated for me. One of the things that was done over the years, and goes back to really the 80s, was when the contribution rates were raised slightly, particularly for Social Security. It also affected Medicare as well. And what that allowed was an additional contribution, or additional taxes were being taken from people. And that built up the trust fund under the understanding that as more baby boomers were working through the 30s, 40s, 50s, then when they started retiring in the 60s, they would start drawing down more of that money. So it was only actuarially sound for a few years, but as we've seen, as more and more people have gotten into Medicare, either because of exemptions or waivers or other things, that trust fund's being run down and depleted at a more rapid pace. And so we've got to do something. We've got to start working on those. I call Social Security and Medicare quasi-entitlements, because we do contribute into them, but we're not contributing enough to pay for the cost. And so the sooner we start working on resolving those, the more tools we'll have at our resources to change those.
Well, very good. Let's take another moment off for our halftime commercial break. We'll be back again in just a moment. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks with Carl Peter John, our guest, United States Representative Ron Estes. So, Representative Estes, there's been a lot of speculation about the composition of Congress after November, especially the House of Representatives. It's often thought that the Democrats may pull out a majority. It's probably going to be close one way or the other, but what would be different if there was a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives rather than Republican as there is now?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, the Democrats are talking about this blue wave. The Democrats and their friends in the media are talking about that. I actually think the Republicans are going to keep control of the House. We're at a all-time high with 240 seats, including a couple of empty seats right now. The Republicans are going to lose some seats, probably 10 to 15. But
That's been the historical trend at this type of off-year election.
Historical trend's actually been more than that. It's been an average of about 30, but you had some really big swing years in that skewed that average. You know, the Tea Party year in 2010 swung it widely towards Republicans. The 1994 when Republicans took control with Gingrich and the contract with America. In 2006 there was a Democrat swing just as a precursor to Obama coming in. So you've seen swing waves that really skew that average. I do think the Republicans will lose a number of seats in the House, but I think we'll maintain the majority there. What we're seeing is a lot more competitive races in a lot of districts this year. But the Democrats have gotten galvanized in terms of that process. There's so much vitriol and hatred towards the president that it's really energized the Democrats. We've got to make sure we keep the Republican turnout strong, like it typically is in an off-election year, and make sure that we get the Republicans turned out to actually support all of our candidates across the district. So I think that the key thing in terms of the Republicans keep control is we can continue some of these good positive growth things that we've done, the regulatory reform, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, and some of that continued growth out of that. Because if the Democrats take control, I mean, the first three things they will do will elect Nancy Pelosi Speaker, they will vote to raise taxes, and they will vote to impeach President Trump and Justice Kavanaugh. And make no bones about it, the Democrats have already been doing it. We've had to vote twice already in the last year and a half to impeach President, against a motion
Right.
to
The
impeach
media
President
hasn't
Trump.
covered that much. How many people voted in support of this impeachment, these impeachment resolutions? I think it was Representative Green from Texas was the
Representative
driver.
Green from Texas has brought it up twice now, and basically a few of the Democrats. I don't remember the exact numbers. Approximately half, but I don't remember if it was just over half of the Democrats or just under half the Democrats
So
voted
a
for
little
it.
less than 100 members of the
Right,
House have already
right.
voted to impeach President Trump.
On no evidence at all. I mean, the whole impeachment process should be based on the rule of law and looking at whether there's been something done and conducted. And we just haven't seen that. The Democrats have made this big political play about impeachment, and first they tried to justify it by Russian collusion, and then tried to do it by obstruction of justice, and it's just one point after the other, when in reality there's no evidence to that effect. The House Judiciary Committee would be the committee that would initiate impeachment proceedings, and in talking to my colleagues there, I haven't seen any evidence. They haven't talked about seeing any evidence at all that would justify going to an impeachment
Well,
process.
the impeachment resolution that was voted on in the House, it was not approved by a committee of the House, was it?
Nope, it was just brought to the floor.
Can that happen under the House rules?
There are particular rules that you can bring up motions, but there are also rules that say those can be set aside to be studied by the Rules Committee instead of actually being voted on. And so it's a matter of whether as it goes to the Rules Committee, whether that is brought up to be voted on specifically on the floor.
Well, kind of similar to that, in a similar vein, is just the culture of investigations that's going on. There are a lot of investigations. The Mueller one is the most prominent. Some people are saying that we need to investigate the Department of Justice and the FBI. If the Democrats do come into power, they're going to flip and start investigating a lot of Republicans and stuff. What's your opinion about all these investigations?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to keep a special prosecutor law just to make sure that there's enough of ability to keep separation from politics. Unfortunately, what we've seen, and we saw Democrats make the accusations during the Clinton years, we're seeing it now, that people bring their personal prejudices and biases to the discussion. We've seen a lot. I mean, there's a handful of FBI agents who really put their personal biases ahead of the integrity of the FBI in some of these investigations. This special prosecutor has just been going on for so long, spend millions of dollars. They're not really finding anything at all dealing with impeachment. There was a little bit dealing with tax on some of the supporters of President Trump, but I think it's time that they kind of wrap up their investigation, bring closure to it, and then we need to look at that whole special prosecution statute and say, what kind of checks and balances do we need to have in that?
Well, the Russian collusion part of the so-called investigation seems to expose more Democrat involvement with the Russians than with the Trump campaign. But having said that, the special counsel statute, the whole Justice Department seems to be in many ways out of control because in theory, Mueller shouldn't have any more powers than a U.S. attorney, but he wasn't even confirmed by anyone. And all the U.S. attorneys have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate before they can take office. And he's sort of a super U.S. attorney. And I think there's some extra constitutionality going on there. Do you find that at all troubling?
I do find it troubling. That's what I meant, is we need to go back and look at that statute, how that's structured. There really aren't any checks and balances over a special prosecutor like Mueller, that it's basically one man being able, or one woman being able to run roughshod once they're put in place, within no time limits, no budgetary constraints. There's no process of saying, okay, when are you done? What's the goalpost? What's the marker that you want to get to? And how do we measure whether you're successful or not, other than just running the clock over and over again? And as we've seen, there are some individuals, particularly a handful of individuals in the FBI, that really showed their personal biases, and we need to make sure that we maintain the integrity of our justice system.
Well, let's take our last commercial break for today on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to our last segment of Wichita Liberty TV. For today, Bob Weeks with Carl Peterjohn and Representative Ron Estes, candidate for re-election to his present position. So we've had some good things come from the Trump administration. You talked about the tax cuts, but we also have a rising deficit with rising deficits projected in the future. We have a trade effort. I don't want to call it a war necessarily, maybe it is, but certainly he's trying to get better deals for trade, but that's really causing some short-term distress. So how would you rate, I think those are probably one of the two of the biggest issues of the Trump presidency. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so let's talk about trade a little bit. I mean, we've been in a trade war for an extended period of time. The United States just hasn't been fighting back. And President Trump was the first president who stood up to the plate and said, we know countries like China have been cheating on trade agreements. We know they've been stealing intellectual property, but presidents up to now haven't done something about it. And President Trump has started that. He actually also started, to look to modernize NAFTA, which very good news out of that over the last few weeks that we've got an agreement with Mexico and Canada finalized on that, which is good because NAFTA has been great for the Kansas economy, for our agriculture economy, for aerospace and other manufacturing, and so that some of the improvements in the new trade agreement with the Mexico and Canada help dairy in particular because Canada had some special provisions for that. So we're looking forward to that continuing to help out.
And I believe that a lot of the focus is always on China, but I believe Canada our largest trading partner.
Canada is our largest.
And Mexico's very big too.
That's right.
So.
That's right. And Canada is our largest trading partner. A lot of, I think in South Central Kansas it's about $7.1 billion worth of exports from Kansas to Canada. So obviously it's something we needed to get done and resolved, and I'm glad to see that we're moving forward on that, which frees us up to go back and focus on China and work against that. All countries in the world basically are in unanimity that China's not being fair in its practices. China's fighting back. They're trying to hurt the president as much as they can in this process by hurting supporters of his across the country. They cherry-picked places where they were going to add tariffs just because they picked basically congressional districts that were supportive of the president. And so we've seen that kind of the behavior by China, which really just proves that they're willing to cheat on trade agreements. And so it's an important thing now. The important thing about getting done with Canada and Mexico that we can focus all our resources on China and push that forward. The temporary program to help provide some assistance for farmers isn't the right thing long term. I mean, farmers don't want that from that standpoint. But it's really a message to China that the government's going to back up farmers and they're going to make sure we move forward with that. At the end of the day, we don't want tariffs. We want free and fair trade. We want open markets because we believe American manufacturers, American farmers can compete great in the world. And we just want to have that free and fair trading. We want to make sure China gets in that, joins the world economy doing that.
Let's jump back on the economy though, because the federal deficit is running about, I don't know how understandable these big numbers are, but it's about $2 billion a day in terms of the current deficit. I think that the most recent figures officially was almost $780 billion
right.
with a B
right.
dollars per year. Even though we've got a nice bump in revenue's growing, but our spending growth seems to be growing even faster. The Trump administration has proposed some areas for some cuts, but Congress has let the ball down. Is it a problem in the House and the Senate or both?
It's a problem in both. I mean, I was one of the first congressmen to stand up and say we need to go back to rescissions, putting rescissions in place. Now, I have to do a little bit of history lesson because neither President George W. Bush or President Obama did rescissions, but presidents before him did hundreds of rescissions. And basically what a rescission is that we approve some anticipated spending on a project through the course of the year. When you get through with that project or get through with the year, if there's money left over, the president can initiate a rescission. Congress passes on it and says, okay, we appropriated, say, $500 million for this project, but it only cost us $450 million. So let's turn that other $50 million back in instead of leaving it dangling out there that somebody could wastefully spend in some form or fashion. So we were able to bring forth the rescission to the floor this summer. for $15 billion in cuts for things like the Zika virus. That that epidemic was here several years ago. That's over and done with. So the sad part in that case was that we couldn't get enough votes on the House floor to even pass that rescission for some of those programs that were no longer needed.
So it's a lot easier to cut taxes and spending, isn't it?
It really is, and cutting
I mean,
taxes.
Ronald Reagan found
Right,
it out.
that's right. And the good thing we've seen out of cutting taxes is that we've seen lots of economic growth going out of that. As you mentioned, we're seeing more revenue this year than we saw last year, even with these lower tax rates. And so that's a positive thing. At the very least, if we could just hold our spending level in 6 or 7 years at the current tax rates, we'd catch up. And we wouldn't have a deficit.
A lot of, like Dan Mitchell, formerly of Cato, strongly believes that if we can just have the public sector, government that is, grow slower than the private sector, before too terribly long, we catch up.
That's
and
right.
And then we'll not be running any more deficits, but we have a lot to pay back. So we're out of time for today, everybody. So Representative Estes, thank you
Thank
very
you,
much
Ron.
for your time today. Carl, thank you for yours. And we'll see you again next week for another episode of Wichita Liberty TV.